This video is part 2 of the previous tutorial that showed how to draw a circle and move it around using basic mouse events. This video shows a pretty powerful concept in Sagebox called the Dev Window or Dev Controls that allows you to kind of ad hoc or creatively add controls without having to think about it or plan it, so you can build your program pretty fast. So let's add some controls to this window. Let's start with a couple sliders. I'm going to start by adding a radius slider, and I'm going to use a function called new slider, and I'm going to put it at 10, 10, x and y position in the window with a length of 200, and I'm going to call it radius. I'm going to copy this and make another slider and call it pen size slider. And I'm also going to label it pen size, and I'm going to put it 50 pixels down from the slider above it. Now, in addition to our circle, we have these two sliders, which is really the beginning of being able to put a lot of controls in our window and making it look nice and doing whatever we want. But for even quicker development, there's another way to do it, and that's called the Dev Controls. And it's a way of putting controls in more automatically. So I can change the new slider, for example, to something called Dev Slider, and I can just specify radius without a location or a length. And I can do the same thing with the pen size. And it will automatically create and place these controls in a separate window, leaving you free to do the more creative work in your main window and then later deal with how you want to use these controls or maybe keep them permanently. We can add a range to these sliders by just expressing the range, so 10 to 300 for the radius and 1 to 50 for the pen size. And when we run it, you can see that the range is reflected in the sliders. When I move the sliders, they stay within the range I just set. The range function is one of many options in Sagebox in the option namespace, and when you type out the name or even the partial name, it'll show you the description of what the option is. And we can string together these options. So for example, I can do a default value, and so I can grab the radius and put it in there as the default. And then with the pen size, I can do the same thing with the pen size as the default. And we don't need the opt prefix. Let's get rid of it in front of range, but then go ahead and keep it in front of default just to show we can go either way with it. So now the sliders come up with the default set for the radius and the pen size. And so now we can take the radius slider and replace radius with it and get a dynamic value using a function called getPos, and we can do the same thing with the pen size slider. So now we can use these sliders to change the size of the circle and the size of the border pretty easily with just a couple lines of code that we've added, and then we also have our other code to move the circle around. I'm going to show some more dev controls in a few seconds, but first let's clean up the program a little bit. We don't really need IOStream anymore, and then let's add some color to the background using the CLS function. Here I'll use the same colors you may have seen before, sky blue dark and sky blue, for the background of the window. So now when we run it, it has a nice gradient for a background, which is just nice and more colorful. And if we look at the definition of sky blue dark, you can see it's just an RGB value. So we can place this RGB value or any RGB value in place of the symbolic value. And so when we run it, we get exactly the same thing we got before because it's the same value. So if we change the red value, for example, to another value, we get a different color, which also looks nice. So we can do whatever we want with the color. But let's go back to the symbolic value. And since we have an event loop, we don't need the exit button anymore. So let's just get rid of that and return 0. Now let's say we want to be able to select an open circle or a filled circle. So we can use the dev controls and make a checkbox. We'll call this filled checkbox, and we'll use dev checkbox, and as with the slider, we'll just state the name of the checkbox and it will place it automatically for us. Now I can use this checkbox to select between an open circle and a filled circle. So I can say if the checkbox is checked, then just draw the plain circle. Otherwise, we'll draw an open circle. And with an open circle, we don't need the actual color anymore because we're just using the border color. And now when we run it, we get this open circle. But I'd like to see the filled circle as the default. So I'm going to set default true to pre-select it. And so when we run it now, we get the default as a filled circle. And when I deselect filled circle, it opens the circle. And we can still use the pen size slider to change the size of the border. So now let's put out the radius information to the dev window by using a text widget. So we can make a text widget with the function dev text. And then what we can do is at the bottom, after we display it, we can use the text widget to display the radius. Let's stylize it a little bit by putting in a foreground color of cyan and also adding a font size of 30. So now we have a radius displaying on the bottom, but I'd rather see it on the top. So let's move text widget from the bottom of the list to the top of the list so it'll place it at the top of the dev window. So now we have our radius displaying on top. So when I use the radius slider, we have this nice display showing the radius as I move it up and down. So let's add a window to the dev window. I'm going to call it dev window, and I'm going to use the dev window function, and I'm going to give it a title info window. We don't need a title, just won't print it. But if we use one, it'll print it. We can use the IO streaming format or we can use printf. In this case, I'm going to put out the radius and the location using some of the embedded text controls. So I'm going to print out the radius in yellow. I'm going to move over to pixel 100, put out the location in green, and I'm going to use the radius slider get position and the circle location X and Y for our location. And then I'm going to close this yellow here so it only prints the value in yellow, otherwise it would continue on in yellow. And when I run it, now I have all this nice real-time information showing me the radius and the location every time I move or change the size of the circle. Let's add what's called a widget so that we can change the color of the circle. I'm going to do this by bringing in colorSelector.h, which is in the same directory as Sagebox. It doesn't have to be, it's just where this one is located. And now we have this new color selector class that we can use to make our widget. So to use this widget, we just need to declare it, and we give it the address of our window and a location, in this case 00 for the upper left-hand corner of the window. So to use it, all we have to do is assign circle color to the get RGB values function, which is always changing based on user input, and we have our color. So when we run it, you can see it in the upper left-hand corner, and when we move the dial, it changes the color of our window. But notice how it doesn't exactly blend in. Let's change that. So there's an option we can use called transparent. So when we put that in, it'll let the color selector blend into the background. So while we're here, let's set the initial color of the color widget to our circle color. That way it'll start with whatever color we pre-select for it. So if we change it to blue, then what we can do is when we run it, we can see that the color selector and the circle are now starting with the same color, and the color selector itself is blending very nicely into the background. But we don't always want the widget to blend embedded in the window like that. So what we can do is we can change transparent. Transparent is an option, and we can add another option called pop-up, and that will cause the color widget to come up in its own window. So I'm going to change the location to say 100, 100, so that it'll come up in a window and look kind of nicely placed in our project. So now that we have the color widget in, we just have a nice way of changing the color with really about 3 lines of code. And so together, the color widget and the DevWindow and a lot of the other Sagebox controls show how easy it is to write programs using the library to get really powerful functions with just a little bit of code. Thanks for watching the video, and keep in mind that Sagebox is a free library tool, and there are a lot of plans to expand it in the next year, so please consider donating to the project in the link in the description, and I will see you in the next video.